There's 5.3 million households in England and Wales where they bought a home that they don't actually own because of a weird quirk of English-Welsh property law.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Harry Scoffin talks about leasehold reform. He says successive governments have failed to stop this ancient feudal power.
Every other country in the world has a form of commonhold where you don't have these powerful land barons.
Harry warns about the dire consequences of refusing to toe the line.
If you stop paying, the freeholder can take your home off you and he can take the whole equity in your property. So it's called forfeiture. It's the most draconian, feudal aspect of leasehold. It really does go back to landlord and serf.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with housing campaigner and journalist Harry Scoffin. Harry, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you're Britain's leading campaigner on this issue of leasehold reform. It's quite a complicated but important one. And can you give us a layman's introduction to the problem you're trying to tackle?
Yeah, so there's 5.3 million households in England and Wales where they bought a home that they don't actually own because of a weird quirk of English-Welsh property law. Basically, every country in the world, when you buy a flat, it's yours, you own it, and you control it. And you're a little bit like Alan Sugar on The Apprentice. If a managing agent or a service provider is ripping you off, you basically go to them and say you're fired. There's obviously an annual general meeting, there's a democratic structure. The problem with leasehold is it harks back to feudalism, not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but the problem is it's ruled by one person, it's a landlord. And for my generation, we spend lots of our life living under a landlord in the private rented sector. We don't want to live under a landlord again, an altogether more powerful landlord, because in a well-functioning rental market, in theory, you can leave a bad landlord behind with your capital intact. The problem with leasehold is you sink your life savings into a property, a home, that you think is yours, but it's controlled by a landlord that is very difficult to remove. But the key thing is if the service charges go up too high, the value of your home, the value of your investment goes down. And there's very little that you can do about it. You know, you can spend money on lawyers, all the rest of it, but it's a system of bewildering complexity that successive governments have tried to reform. But it's like that Albert Einstein quote. Someone said the other day that he didn't actually say it, but it's a good quote anyway, that doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results is the equivalent of insanity. But that's what our MPs have been doing for decades now. Going back to 1884, Lord Randolph Churchill wanted to enfranchise leaseholders, to let them buy the freehold. And the word enfranchisement and franchise is very important because it goes back to democracy. In this country, for generations, leaseholders, because they're tenants in the law of property, they're not property owners. So to be able to vote on the people that are representing your interest in Parliament, you had no right, you had no suffrage. So now, all these years later, women have the right to vote. But we have a form of second-class citizen among our midst, people in their homes where they feel like there's a form of taxation without representation, that the people that are levying taxes on them, in this case it's service charges, they can't remove, they can't elect them. That's wrong.
So people move into the house, they buy the house, but they're kind of living as a renter because they're paying these service charges, ground rents. And is there any cap or regulation on what these charges can be, how much they can increase by and what they actually pay for?
So that's a really good question. So there's lots of laws on service charge, I'll tell you that, but there's no capping of the level and they just have to be reasonable or reasonably incurred. So that is how long is a piece of string. And the problem is that if you feel that you're being ripped off on service charge, your really only port of call is to go to tribunals, the first tier tribunal. Now it says that it's not a court, but you've got a judge in there, you've got a panel, you might have a surveyor on there, you might even have a top silk, you know, a KC on that panel. And the problem is that you probably will have to self-represent unless you've got the money for a barrister, you know, and a solicitor. So it's very expensive. And the problem is that it's not necessarily what the law says. It's also about who's got the better argument. And the fact is that if you've not got the best lawyers, you are going to lose. And the problem is the Consumer Group in 2011 found that leaseholders were being overcharged at least £700 million in service charges. Now, Hamptons last year found something I would even say is worse, to be honest, that actually England's flat leaseholders were paying a staggering £7.6 billion in service charges. Now, to walk that back, some of that will be for the legitimate upkeep and insuring of blocks of flats, but it won't all be. It will be insurance kickbacks. It will be commissions to related companies, because the freeholders, while they appoint the managing agent, they are the power behind the throne. They get to decide, ultimately, what service charges are levied. They get to decide who gets the contract. So if the roof needs to be fixed, who will get the contract? It will be a related company. So the incentive structure in leasehold is completely flawed, because the person benefiting from the increased costs is not the person paying those costs. So there's a conflict of interest there. And the problem is the government have brought forward this bill, but it doesn't really deal with the fact that you've got someone there running around spending someone else's money who is unaccountable to the person paying those bills. And the fact is that it actually benefits them to bring up the service charge, because actually they own the freehold, but the value of the freehold, yes, it's reliant on how much ground rent and we can talk about that after, but how much ground rent they get, but it's also about all of the more illicit fees. It's about the insurance commissions. It's about the service charges. And the problem is that they can bring up the service charge, these freeholders, these so-called landlords, but actually it doesn't negatively impact the value of their investment. It actually pushes it up, because they can borrow against the freehold more with the banks. And the point is that what's very interesting is that Michael Gove, the Secretary of State for Housing, last year said he wanted to abolish this fundamentally unfair, feudal, abusive, every word under the sun system. The bill doesn't do that. It does it on houses going forward. It doesn't do it on flats, which is where the real money is. But what's interesting is that we've spoken to top sources in government, but outside of government too, that are very clued up on this policy area. And they said to me, and some of the people in our campaign, Free Leaseholders, that the reason why government are not abolishing leasehold on flats going forward is because it will reduce the value of property developers' land banks. So this is a really big issue, and it's all about political economy, and it's all about where power lies. And the fact is that although there's 5.3 million leasehold households in England and Wales, we're not mobilised yet. There's no financial punch behind the campaign. But these freeholders, they're in the tax havens. Some of them are billionaires. I'm not going to name them on this show, but the fact is that they're very politically well connected. Their tentacles stretch deep into Parliament and into Whitehall. I've got to do this, because if I don't do it, no one else will. And the groups that have been in this for so long, they've failed us, because there they are hobnobbing with civil servants, hobnobbing with MPs. But the government have been talking about leasehold reform for 7 years now. 2017, Theresa May era. We'd just had Brexit. All the work had been done, and yet there was going to be all these reforms in the final Queen's speech before, our former Queen died, and it was removed at the last minute. People in number 10 in Boris Johnson's government said it was unconservative, anti-business, and not going to win any votes. The first two are a load of rubbish, so unconservative. Margaret Thatcher was pushing on this in the 1960s. Her last day as Prime Minister, she gave the green light to a bill to bring forward Commonhold, which would be a scheme that would replace leasehold, and they've got versions of it in America, in Canada, in Italy, in Thailand, called condominium, in Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, other parts of Southeast Asia, and also the Middle East. They call it strata title. In Europe, they call it co-ownership. And the fact is, every other country in the world has a form of commonhold, where you don't have these powerful land barons, freeholders or building owners. The building owners are the people that have bought the flats, and then they appoint the managing agent. So the fact is, we've got a bill here that is better than nothing. We're grateful in a way for it, but it's taken 7 years for the government to get this far. They don't understand it enough, because if they did, we would have got a really quite meaty bill, which is more ambitious than it is. Yeah. Because leasehold houses, I'm being honest, less than 1% of all new build houses are leasehold now. It's yesterday's scandal. The real money, the real abuse is in leasehold flats. Right. And, I speak to people in the leasehold sector that are on the other side, surveyors and things like that. And they say, they all work for these freeholders. And one of them was saying to me the other week that one of their freeholder clients, who also happens to be a property developer, said that I'm really looking forward to getting my new milking parlour soon, because, they've just done a whole new development of blocks of flats. So leaseholders, they are basically someone else's cash cow.
So can you give us some examples? This is obviously an issue that's affected you. You must have some really good examples.
Starts at home, doesn't it? My mum now is paying £33,000 a year for a 3-bed with no swimming pool, no gym, no garden. And yet the freeholder is one of Britain's richest men, sheltering in a tax haven in Monaco. He's
So
a billionaire.
That's not a rent or anything. She
No,
owns the property.
She's bought the leasehold, she's bought the flat, but the freeholder is someone that is separate from her that she can't remove. And the point is that she has no rights to get rid of him. She can't buy the freehold because there happens to be a hotel underneath, which we also find ourselves paying for in the service charge accounts, and we can't get right to manage.
So what is the 33,000 paying for?
Well, it's supposed to be paying for maintenance of lifts that they break every few months and they never seem to get fixed. They're supposed to be cleaning windows. I mean, you can barely see out of them. And they're supposed to stop things like leaks. And our building sprouts more leaks than a tea bag. The fact is that our building is not getting maintained. And you know what? It's not about me or my mum or our building. This is happening in blocks up and down the country.
Someone in your mum's position,
So-
can she stop paying?
Well, the problem is, and that's the worst thing, anyone watching this programme, do not stop paying. You've got to keep paying. And that sounds absurd, but if you stop paying, the freeholder can take your home off you. And he can take the whole equity in your property. So it's called forfeiture. Right. It's the most draconian, feudal aspect of leasehold. It really does go back to landlord and serf. So on a debt, and it only has to be over £350. So that's a small amount of money that could be in dispute. If it's just over 350, and say if your home is worth £350,000, say, the whole 350,000 will go back to the freeholder. Now, yes, there's a court process to it, and then you could potentially go, oh, stop, I'll pay the bill. But by that point, it's almost too late because it's going to cost thousands or tens of thousands in legal costs to defend it and sort it out. And the thing is, this is so interesting because the bill doesn't deal with forfeiture. And there's been a huge row, and when I gave evidence to the Public Bill Committee on this in January, I was literally the only person over 2 days of hearing to have made this argument first. And it was, we need to get rid of forfeiture because it's not right that someone who anyway only owns 2.5% of a block of flats can have that sheer amount of power over a homeowner. I guess under the law we're a tenant, but the fact is it's completely wrong. If they need to get the debt back, get the debt back. Don't get all of the other equity. And the thing is that what we find in leasehold is that sometimes the debts aren't even genuine. It's like a manipulated service charge demand, and then they go, oh, it's over 350, I'm going to do forfeiture. And obviously it goes to the county court, but that's a very stressful process. And the fact is that if people knew this, it's like, buying cigarettes. If there was a health warning on the side of when you're about to look at buying a leasehold flat, say in the windows of the estate agents, no one would be buying flats because if they knew that their capital could be confiscated like that on a tiny bill, and even, if you go into personal bankruptcy proceedings, it's £5,000. Why on earth is it 350? So there's been a huge row. Labour were very good on this. They brought forward amendments to try and abolish this crazy feudal, extortionist tool of forfeiture. And the Tories keep voting it down. But to give some credit to the government, they know the strength of feeling on the issue. When there was the report stage, third reading debate, so it's sort of at the end of its stream for the House of Commons with the MPs, the Housing Minister Lee Rowley said that he hopes there to be some news on this shortly. And he said it again the next day in the Westminster Hall debate. Grenfell. We have to talk about Grenfell. It's not right on this programme not to talk about Grenfell where, 72 people had lost their lives. That was a social block, but what happened after Grenfell was it set off a whole debate about, are these other buildings unsafe? And if they're unsafe, do we remove the cladding? Now, this is really important to understand leasehold and why it shot up the agenda as well. It's not just our campaigning. Is because there were all these private sector blocks, blocks of flats, apartment buildings, whatever we call them, tower blocks, with dangerous cladding. And sometimes they had more than dangerous cladding. They had missing fire breaks, key things that should have been there that were not built to the regulations anyway. And the point is, someone had to pay to remove that cladding and fix those defects. But there was a huge row in government and in Parliament about who should pay and beyond, because the freeholders were saying, we're just as innocent as the leaseholders. We bought a property from a developer. We bought the freehold. We had no idea it was unsafe. We didn't build these buildings. And then the leaseholders come out and say, but we're the tenants. We don't own these buildings. Why should we pay to remove the cladding or make these buildings safe? There is a building owner, right? But the problem is the freeholders didn't have a leg to stand on because in the good times, they were saying we're the building owners and then they control all the incomes and make the money. And then as soon as they're supposed to pay for a once-in-a-generation situation about dangerous cladding. They then said, and they've said it publicly, which is even more funny, they said, we're not the building owner. We just own 2.5% of the capital value. So what is it? It's Schrodinger's building owner. One minute you're the building owner, the next minute you're just a speculator in someone else's home. But then now we're talking about leasehold reform. They've gone back to we're the building owner. We're the professional landlords. We're the noble custodians. And the point is that many housing ministers got swayed by that freeholder lobby until Michael Gove. And he thought, well, first of all, we're going to basically threaten extrajudicially the property developers. So if they don't do these legally binding contracts with the government to remove the cladding on developments that they've built, I think, in the last 20 or 25 years, they'll be banned from receiving any planning permission forever. And he passed a law to actually make good on that threat. So if they didn't sign, their business models are gone. And then he said, but fair enough, there are some developers that have gone to the ground, they're liquidated, they're no longer in business, or they're overseas that are harder to get. So we're going to have to go after the freeholders, the freeloaders, the building owners, the so-called noble custodians. If they're noble custodians, they need to start paying like noble custodians. So he then said, if the developer can't pay or not in existence, all the rest of it, it goes to the freeholder. So they created this elaborate scheme called the waterfall. So the idea is that it would hit the developer first. If the developer's not in existence, it hits the freeholder. And then at the last case, it will hit the leaseholders. Before Michael Gove got in, the leaseholders are at the top of the waterfall.
Right.
But you know what? The thing is, it's not just the developers and the freeholders that need to be on the hook. It's also the government, because successive governments have presided over the deregulation of the built environment, which has allowed really shoddy, even dangerous buildings to be built perfectly legally. So that's why the taxpayer's been paying billions of pounds to remediate these buildings too. So the thing is that the freeholder lobby is very weak right now. Not only have they lost the morality argument, they've lost the argument about actually whether they are that vital for the upkeep of buildings. And given that every other jurisdiction in the world don't have institutional freeholders, the freeholders are the residents themselves that appoint the managing agent, and because of the Grenfell effect, and going back to the Grenfell effect, because of these horrific stories where, you meet some of these leaseholders, and one of them I met in Stevenage, the flat was only worth £230,000 when she bought it, and she was whacked by the freeholder with a £200,000 bill, just her share,
Really?
to remove the cladding. And that was where it just got out of hand. And that's why Michael Gove had to do something, because all his predecessors were all saying, and one of them even came out and said, caveat emptor, buyer beware, almost blaming leaseholders for buying into unsafe buildings. But the problem is, when you buy a flat, you have no legal right to get a full structural survey of the building. So the problem is, you cannot blame the buyer at all. They're completely an innocent, in a way, sometimes naive as well, because the developers will withhold information, even something as basic as service charges. We've got evidence that developers are low-balling service charges to hook buyers in, and then 2 years later they go through the roof, because obviously the service charges were way too low. They were not realistic for the upkeep of the building, because you've got to keep the lights on, you've got to keep the lifts going, you need to have regular window cleans every quarter. But the key thing is that the gap now between house and flat prices in England is its widest since 1995, so nearly 30 years. So everyone in this country is running for the hills. They don't want to buy flats because they've seen that an Englishman's home isn't his castle when it's a flat, because it's the mighty landlords, it's a feudal setup.
So this has been going on for a long time, and people don't mind if the freehold charges a peppercorn rent and they pay it maybe begrudgingly. But do you think it's a greed thing that has pushed this more into the spotlight in recent times?
So this is really good, because you speak to leaseholders that were there in the campaigning era of the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, and they said it was nothing like it is today. Because what happened is it was a financialisation of housing in the late 90s, but really the early 2000s property boom, where you had people from all sorts of overseas jurisdictions piling into property in England and Wales, but especially London. When you had a one-up, one-down, a house conversion to flats, leasehold wasn't the deal that it is where you've got purpose-built developments, big blocks of flats where you're looking at 50, 80, 100. Some of these buildings, in Manchester city centre, but Leeds I'm seeing, Birmingham, but, Isle of Dogs, London Docklands, but, Battersea, you're looking at 5, 6, 7, 800 units or homes in a single building. And that's where the real money is being made. So down the road from where I live, I'm not going to name it, obviously, for obvious reasons, but the freeholder had made, and he's based in a tax haven, made £1.6 million on commission from buildings insurance. That's just one line item in a service charge budget. So if that's happening in a block, in a development of 325 flats, it will be happening almost everywhere on those big developments. And these are the developments that people, colloquially call the milking parlour developments. So in a way, it's not necessarily the one up, one down where, as you said, it's a peppercorn ground rent, which is zero financial value, by the way. Or, you might be paying 800 quid service charge, and, you don't get much for it. It's annoying, but it's not the thousands of pounds people are paying in these newer blocks. And I think that's the real battleground. And it's also about developers. You know what? Developers in Australia and America, they make lots of money from selling common hold or condominium, or in Australia and New Zealand and other parts, strata title flats. So the fact is, it's not about hitting the profitability of developers. And the fact is, I think that's the key thing, that we are absolutely fine for people making profits. It's where people are not providing a service and they're clearly just sponging and they're like parasites. That's wrong. And they only make that money because of the anti-competitive nature of the leasehold system, that the people that are paying the bills cannot easily change service provider. And that's people in other countries, when I do these, conferences and talks for people in, Hong Kong, Singapore, where a lot of them, they do buy flats here. They say, well, you can change your mobile phone provider. Can't you do that with a block of flats? Because that's what they can do over there with strata schemes or, resident controlled schemes. And I said, no. I said, for the most important purchase of life, you can't just say you're fired. And that's where abuse flourishes. And you know what? This is what I say at all these conferences where I get angry people that are in their 50s and 60s, that probably are from the freeholder side, saying, how dare you? You should be talking about homelessness or planning reform or private rented. And I say, no, there are brilliant groups that are doing that already. And I said, all we want, Michael or whoever they're called, it's normally always men, believe it or not. And I say, all we want is what your generation took for granted, freehold home ownership. And the fact is that because houses are so expensive now, and probably will forever be, unless we get planning reform, and even then there's a question mark, flats will always be cheaper than houses. So if we need to detoxify that first rung on the ladder, and actually it's selfish that people are going around saying that what they have isn't good enough for us and that we need leasehold. And I think that's the key thing. These freeholders know that they can't make a moral case because there is no moral case. So they're hiding behind paid media now. And they've got PR firms, and we're doing this as grassroots volunteers. We don't get any money out of this. We don't, I'm not employed. No one's employed here. There's volunteers that are doing it because we know that the cause is just.
So, politics aside, looking at it from the other side, if you think about an old guy who's put his retirement eggs into the basket of getting some freeholds and has some income coming in from that, and he feels, this is being taken away from me. This is kind of how the law has always worked. Suddenly you want to change everything. What would you say to someone like that?
So this is really interesting because the freeholder lobby are starting to invoke granny and granddad and even pension funds to try and protect their own interests, which are separate. And what's interesting is that the government's own data has found that less than 1% of pension funds are in residential property. Right. So the fact is it's absolutely minuscule. And the thing is that these are sophisticated investors. These are globally diversified pension funds. They are not going to be getting involved in a very odd asset class like residential ground rents in England and Wales, which for the last 7 years government has been saying they want to get rid of. They've been basically saying that leasehold is a crooks charter and we're going to be intervening in existing leasehold contracts. And what's interesting is the 2019 Conservative Manifesto said that they had pledged in the manifesto, it's a manifesto commitment, people voted for it, nearly 14 million people did, that they were going to restrict ground rents to a peppercorn. They didn't say restrict ground rents to a peppercorn on new leases, they said restrict ground rents to a peppercorn. That encapsulates existing. And there was an article in the Telegraph a few weeks ago which played on the heartstrings, and it had clearly been placed by one of these freeholder lobby groups, and it was about like one or two guys up in the north that had bought ground rents, but one of them had bought like 600 or 900 freeholds. I'm sorry. The first rule of investment is never to put your eggs in one basket. You spread your risk. You diversify. You make sure that that is the case. So I don't have that much sympathy for a few people that took wrong investment decisions. So, it's that. And then there's the other argument that this is not an honest way of making money. basically hitching a ride to other people's homes and basically buying up the ground from beneath their feet to make a ground rent. And it's not like service charges where you have to provide a service. You know, under the law, you do need to provide that. Whether they do or not is another question. With ground rent, it's pure profit. It's not for a service or benefit to the leaseholder. There's now a two-tier market. All the new leasehold properties have zero ground rent, a peppercorn, but for the existing, people are paying hundreds, thousands. You know, my neighbour's paying £1,500 a year in ground rent. And, you know, we have all the problems we have in our block. It's going to go up to 3,000 in a few years' time. That's money for nothing. Gove gets it. And I think the thing is they're having to invoke pension funds and pensioners because they know they can't really say, oh, ground rent gives you this, ground rent gives you that. They can't say that because legally that's not true. It's bogus. So the thing is that, but the key thing, and they never say it publicly, and I really want to debate them, and they don't want to debate me, and they don't want to debate any consumer interest in leasehold. But you know what? If they're watching this and they're up for a debate, anytime, anywhere, I'll debate them. Even with a slightly biased chair, I will do that, and I will beat you. I think it's not about leasehold. It's not even about the housing crisis now. It's about who does this country work for? Who does our political class work for? And, you know, yeah, who's got more power and who can get the laws written in a way that benefits them? And I think that's the key thing. And I think now inequality, you know, housing affordability in a way has helped leasehold campaigners because I think you've got to go back to like the 1800s for, you know, your income to match up with the cost of housing. I think it's now like 8 times average salaries. In London, it's 14 times average salaries. So you've got to go back to the Dickens era. So in a way, already it's very expensive and difficult to get on the property ladder. And then you hear that beyond your really expensive mortgage payments, you've got a whole load of other costs that you can't control. In theory, with a mortgage provider, you could go and get a better deal. I know it's constrained at the moment, but when it calms down, you'll have choice. But with leasehold, you've got no choice on these service charges. There's a young leaseholder called Jenny. She's a bit older than me. I think she's about 29 or 30. And, you know, she had to sell her flat at a £50,000 loss because the insurance charges went through the roof. And she had no say in those insurance charges. And the fact is she got into a load of debt as a result of that. She's out of it now, but the fact is her parents feel so guilty. You know, her grandparents feel guilty about it, that they helped her onto the property ladder, but it just made her ill and it destroyed her finances. And even now, she's having to sort out that debt situation. So the thing is that it isn't just, I think that's the big problem leaseholders have had, that it's kind of been seen as, oh, well, this is a London lovey issue. This isn't really an issue affecting real people. But the thing is that through the opinion polling we've managed to get commissioned, you know, with opinion, but through the stories we've been telling in our videos, through the stories we've been placing in the media, like there's this lovely lady called Nicola Hawkins in Romford. Her flat, I think she only bought it for about £200,000 or £230,000. Really not a huge amount of money, you know, but that's all she could afford. And she was threatened with forfeiture a few weeks ago. The whole home was going to go. And it was in the Telegraph. And it's just appalling, you know, that someone that thought they bought their home can be extorted in their own home. No, this is about the soul of the nation. It's about whether when people buy homes, they're homeowners, or are they cash cows for tax dodgers and quite murky interests. And you know what? We're all for capitalism, and that's going to be that's kind of our big message. We want capitalism. This isn't capitalism. This is rent seeking. This is distortion of the market. This is basically cartel-like behaviour. And the fact is, anyone that's capitalistic or wants, you know, pro-business policies, that is to move away from leasehold. So people can then appoint their own service providers like they do in Scotland and every other country in the world under common hold systems. So this is it. Yeah. So thanks for having me today.
Harry Scoffin, thanks for joining us.